A pleasant good day to everyone. And we'll be looking at the skeletal system. And this will be part one. So this is a two-part in which we'll be looking firstly at the axial skeleton, and then we'll be looking at the appendicular in a follow-up session. So in terms of the skeletal system, what you would have picked up from your lecture is that the functions of the skeletal system is to support, protect, facilitate movement involving blood cell formation, most critically both storage of calcium, and this has to do with the action of the osteoblast and the osteoclast in terms of the release of calcium. Of course, this comes under the control of the hormone. Which hormone is related to calcium homeostasis? Very good, the parathyroid hormone, right, PTH, and that's the one that is associated. Okay, Nadia, gotcha. So the parathyroid hormone is associated with storage of calcium, and of course, calcium is released and is very important. In terms of calcium, what is it important for? What organ system in particular uses calcium? There's one more than the other, and it is you. Which one of them uses it?
So repeat the question, please.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking,
which organ system in terms of calcium? There's one that uses a lot of calcium for its functioning. Which one is it?
I'm going to say.
You looked at it in SnF I.
Pretty muscular system.
There you go. I think that's what you wanted to say. It was on the tip of your tongue. So it's happened sometime. You know, it's like a mosquito zinging around your ears. You know, and you know it was there. So very good there. So the muscular system, calcium is very important to facilitate muscle contraction in terms of active myosin movement, in terms of that contraction.
That is why I almost said cardiovascular, because
you're thinking of calcium.
Function.
Yeah, you're thinking of muscle. And when you hear muscle, what comes to mind is the heart. So now you're trying to, you're having a conflict in your mind, you know, in terms of, okay, you know it's muscle, but you know it's not the heart. So what's going on? Why am I thinking heart? You're thinking of the cardiovascular, the cardiac muscle. Yes. So calcium most definitely involved in muscle contraction. Storage of fat, right? It is important as well. That's the yellow bone marrow. Blood cell formation. We talk about those are stem cells, very important in terms of blood cell formation found in the bone marrow, right? And then, of course, bringing about movement, interaction among the three organ systems, the nervous system, muscular, and skeletal system. For protection, one of the things, how does the skeleton protect? How does it do that?
Like in the instance of the ribs, so it will form a barrier for the soft muscles inside the, like the ribs and the heart.
Right. So in terms of those organs, it does form a barrier. And in general, when you look at your body, anything that's important is encased in bone. So what do we mean by that? Well, the hematopoietic stem cells, which make red blood cells, are red blood cells important? Okay, that's a facetious question. Yeah, they are, because they carry around oxygen. That oxygen is used, if you look at it from a simplistic perspective, when food is broken down, and now we have the absorption of nutrients into the blood. In particular, if you look at a simple type, sugars, we're looking at glucose. The glucose then goes along the cardiovascular system into the cell cytoplasm. And when it gets into the cytoplasm, you have that breakdown of the food, the glucose, via the process of glycolysis. Right? Cytoplasmic reduction causes free ATP formation, then pyruvate, which is formed as the end product, shuttled into the mitochondria, where you have between 30 to 32 ATP formed. So collectively, for every breakdown of one glucose molecule, you have 35, well, you have 30 to 36 ATP being formed, right? So very important in terms of those red blood cells, hence the reason why bone marrow is encased in bone. Very important. If what would happen if we didn't have that ability to make red blood cells? Well, how long does a red blood cell last? What is the average lifespan for a red blood cell before it is broken down in the spleen? What's the average lifespan?
We want to go with 10 days.
10 days? All right, you say 10 days.
28 days.
I'm not going to say 10 or 30.
About a month, 3 weeks,
3 to 4 months.
or 3 weeks.
All right, I'm
And
hearing
this
10
is an
days.
age
So
status we are
it's
talking
really,
about.
yeah. So somebody who said 3 to 4 months, they were more on it in terms of the
Okay.
lifespan. Well, for adults anyway, yeah, it's 3 to 4 months that a red blood cell. So what would happen if for some odd reason something would go wrong with your your bone marrow? Yeah, the clock will start to tick, and then you wouldn't have production because the stem cells, those are the ones, the hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow, they produce red blood cells. So if they're not producing red blood cells, well, what would happen? Ultimately, it start to feel weaker because your ability to actually to do the things associated with the red blood cells would be diminished, primarily among them carrying of oxygen. This oxygen, as we mentioned, used to break down food. All right, so blood cell formation, bone marrow encased in bone, most critically. Storage of calcium. Calcium is stored in bone. Why? Because calcium is critical for muscle contraction. Fat is another food storage, and also it does perform the function in the adipose tissue. When you look at the skin, it does perform other function, cushioning, and also providing warmth. Right, so all of the major functions of the skeletal system has to do really with protection. All right, so now skeletal system, one of the major components is long bone. And let me ask you this, why do they call long bones? Anybody? It's for a simple reason. Don't overthink it. They call it long bones because it is,
Length.
yeah, because it's long, yeah, as opposed to a short bone, which is short. When you look at a typical long bone, you'd see that there are certain parts associated with the bone. The shaft or the diaphysis shown here. Then you have the epiphyses, which are the ends of the bone itself. Also, you would notice there's a layer of compact bone, which is really to the outer part in this section. And then you have an inner spongy bone. Now, how do we remember which part comes first? All right, anybody here likes to chew chicken bones? Right, if you remember, we'll be talking chew chicken bone. You have to crack it first. And after you crack it, then you start to chew, right? Because as we are well aware, the marrow is actually flavor. It's a very good flavorful thing. So the reason why you have to crack it first is because it's a nice way to remember it. There's compact bone on the outside, and the inside, which is, is readily chewable. That's the spongy bone. And why do they call spongy bone? For another simple reason.
They look like sponge.
Yeah, it looks like a sponge. Yeah, it does. It does look like sponge. So that's why they call it spongy bone. All right. Also important to note, oftentimes when we think about the skeleton, we think about those things where you see in horror movies, the white thing walking around. But you have to remember, it's really, it is transverse by blood, by a lot of blood cells, in terms of you do have this vasculature going through the bone itself. There's also nerves as well, which is why when you do get a bone break, or if you do have pressure applied to the bone, it does have that sensitivity associated with it. So it's very important to note those facts. Bone, as we know, the ones that we see, that's really dried bone. But in and of itself, bone is red, as we could identify with, for those of us who cutting up, and they're cutting up meat, cutting up chicken and so on, you see it is red. Bone tissue is really red and healthy looking in that regard. So let's have a little more a look at the compact bone. And this is a stain. This is iodine, the only stain really that gives a black coloration that I could remember in terms of all the stains. Right? So compact bone stained with iodine, and it shows then the compact bone makeup, osteocytes, right? These are the supporting cells. You have the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. Out of the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts, which one build up and which one break down?
The class, I would say breakdown.
Right. Nice way to remember it.
Yeah, so
when I think of
builds
up, yeah. And yeah, so I remember one of your colleagues in another class earlier, incarnation, she mentioned to me, when you think about a blast, think about the Big Bang Theory that, formed the Earth. There was this big explosion initially, boom, and then the Earth was formed. So that's how she remembered it, in terms of an osteoblast brings about the formation to osteoblasts. They build it up. And of course, when your calcium levels fall low, then of course, the PTA, parathyroid hormone, that is secreted, and that causes the osteoclast now to actually bring them down. All right. I think, yes, some people drawing little lines on the screen. It's all good. It's all good. Creativity there. That's very good. So that was compact bone. Let's look now at spongy
Sorry
bone.
about that.
It's
My
all
phone
good.
pressed by
Not an
accident.
issue. Not an issue. Creativity personified. Let's go on with spongy bone. So the spongy bone consists of trabeculae, which are small plates of tissue and red bone marrow. So these are, of course, the spongy bone. They are located at the ends of the bone, here in the epiphyses, right? So here you see the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis. So-called, the proximal is close to the joint, and then further away from it, you have the distal epiphysis. All right, so now let's speak to the axial skeleton. The axial, so-called because it runs down the center of the body, or the axis, and it comprises of the skull, the vertebra, and the ribs and the sternum itself. Let's have a look at the skull. The skull has a particular joint associated with it, which is known as the Lambdoid Joint. And this is where, if you're looking at it, here's the parietal bone. This is it's shown here, the parietal, and this is the occipital bone to the back. So in between the parietal and occipital bone, you do have this lambdoid suture, and it's so called because it looks like the Greek letter lambda, which is an upside down Y. All right, so that's the reason why they call it this suture, and it is an immovable joint. For the most part, the joints of the skull are immovable, and that enables you to get head-on, let's say, to deflect blunt force trauma, most trauma, which could occur to the skull itself, thereby protecting the brain from any further injury. When we look at babies, however, we have a little bit of a difference. We have these spaces, and not only do we have these incompletely formed bones occurring in the skull, you also have them occurring in the jaw and also in the vertebral column as well. The reason why you do have these incomplete or non-fused bones is this allows for joint expansion to accommodate the growing brain in this case, and for the vertebra, for the growing skull, for this growing spinal column. The jaw as well, the growing jaw. So that hence the reason why you do have this incomplete junction formed in the jaw, skull, and in the spinal vertebral column. So that's to allow for expansion. In the head, they're known as fontanelles. And what the old people is called this area here. So we're looking down on it. So the mole of the head. And how do you say to close it up? What you could do? What you rub on it?
Coconut
Coconut
oil.
oil and
Coconut oil and squeeze it.
Squeeze it in and pour in a hat for them when they're small.
Really? I didn't know
All
about
kind of
this.
thing.
Yeah, they say all kind of thing. I didn't know about the squeezing it in. It feels so delicate, when you're touching it. Yeah,
No,
like
not hard, you're not squeezing it hard, you just
oh,
like
gently. Oh,
gently.
okay. Rub,
Yeah,
massaging it. Oh, okay.
yeah.
All right. Yes. So indeed. Right. So that's massaging it. And
Excuse me.
mhm.
Sorry, I said she had to support for me.
Okay. Thank you. No problem. Right. So those are the fontanelles or those spaces. Next we could.
Excuse,
Yes.
I
Go
have a
ahead.
question.
Mhm.
For like babies, that does the reason why the head have these spaces not to help accommodate gluten
Oh, yes.
as
So
well.
it's more than one reason. So one is to accommodate the birthing process. So you do have distortion in the skull as it comes through the vaginal passage, because you can imagine if this was, baby's head big, if it was all solid, we definitely will be looking at vaginal tearing that would occur during the delivery process. And even though it does exist in terms of the fontanelle, some people do get vaginal tearing, right? So most definitely this is because you will have a deformation of the skull as it fits through the vaginal passage during vaginal deliveries. So most definitely that is another reason why you do have it in terms of that. So that's another reason. And the other reason, of course, is because, the brain is growing as well. So yeah, that's a very good point you raised there. When we're looking at the skull, here it is, it's color coded. So do take notes of the colors, because when you look at different sections, the colors remain constant. Here you have the frontal bone. The parietal is to the top and back. You can see that in just a little bit more. This one here, you have the lacrimal bone, the nasal bone, the maxilla, and the one below is mandible. How do we know the difference? One of your colleagues pointed out that men usually have beards. So therefore, when you think about the mandible, think about the area below. And therefore, the other one is maxilla. So that way you don't mix up the two instead. This one is this bone here, the zygomaticus, or your cheekbone, very prominent in some persons. And it's of course, as with other bones, once it is broken, yeah, quite painful indeed. These are the orbits in which the eyes are usually, not usually, but where the eyes are found in the human. This is looking at a side-on view. And again, this is the frontal bone. This will be the parietal bone here. Notice the color coding, light blue. To the back here is the occipital bone. One way to remember it, how I remember it, when I think about ox, I think about a cow, and cows usually have tails. So therefore, when I think about the brain, with the tail being the spinal cord, well, the spinal cord comes out to the back to the foramen magnum, right? So therefore, this bone, which contains the foramen magnum, I always think about it like that. I think about a cow tail. I call it the occipital bone. Also known, I call it the moo bone. Because when I think about moo, you know, the sound a cow makes, moo. So that's how I correlate and think about it, right? So please don't put moo bone on any of your standardized exams. You'll get it wrong. It's the occipital bone. All right, color coding again to show you the different bones. Notice there here is the foramen magnum in the occipital bone, and this is where the spinal cord leaves the skull. So it leaves, we're looking down on the skull. You know, if you look here, they make this cut, they remove it. So we're looking down on the skull, hence this is the foramen magnum. So if it was there, you're looking directly down onto the spinal cord, going down to the coccygeal region. All right, so the vertebra, again, the spinal cord leaving the foramen magnum. So the brain usually sits in here, and the spinal cord leaves via this foramen magnum, which is an opening in the occipital bone. So you have these vertebra, 7, 12, 5, 5, coccygeal, the sacral and the coccygeal are the last ones. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacrum, which are fused, and 4 coccygeal, which are really fine bones. So how do you remember 7, 12, 5, 5, 4? One way of doing it, if you could think about your meals, you know, breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, snack at 5, and just repeat 5, and then just, well, take away 1, you get 4. But it gives you a nice ballpark in terms of at least getting the 7, 12, and the 5, you know, in order. That's how I relate it, you know, those vertebra. One of the things you'll notice, or let me ask this question. What could you say about the vertebra, both in terms of the curvatures and the sizes as you go from the cervical down to the coccyx, or at least from the cervical down to the lumbar? What could you tell me about the sizes of the vertebra in terms of their thickness? Does it increase or decrease going from the cervical
It's
down?
increased by the lumbar because of the weight that it needs to carry.
Very good, yeah, because it carries more weight. And in between the vertebra, you have these intervertebral discs. As you get older, do these discs get thicker or thinner? And therefore, do you get taller or shorter as you age?
You get
Yeah,
shorter.
Yeah, you get shorter. I don't know if you ever notice, you know, certain persons as they get older, they actually do get shorter.
Punch.
Yeah, haunch as well. You know, I was looking, I don't know how many of you all recently have been looking at the Queen, you know, Queen Elizabeth II. And yeah, she's going down. I mean, of course, we know not the hour or the day, but Now she walks with a cane at all times. But of course, you know, for observing protocol, they don't take pictures of her with the cane, but whenever they do show these off pictures, she has to walk with a cane and she's haunched, yeah, in terms of the curvature of the spine. Again, that probably has a lot to do with hereditary, your genes, in terms of that curvature. Because I know some persons, and I'm sure you can identify with it, batting at 100 and they're walking straight and upright. Whereas others, you know, they do have that curvature. So it has a lot to do with genetics as well. But yeah, I was looking at the queen and she doesn't make as many appearances anymore, but she's definitely, the curvature has increased. Right? So in terms of the vertebra, yes, go ahead.
So is it that, as you said, with age, you know, we get that kind of hunch shape, right? Is it that the discs themselves are they wearing away and they're getting smaller, or the curve, you know, is getting more pronounced? So
that's
you're
a
going
very
down.
good question. Both happens. You do have compression because remember you're looking at 60, 70, 80 years of carrying the weight. So by nature, granted, yes, is usually replace the cartilage, but as you get older, everything slows down. Why does everything slow down as you get older? There's a
Because your
reason.
metabolism changes.
Your metabolism changes.
So because you as an individual, you slow down.
Right. But there is an interesting theory which has been put down. You
With
slow
your
down because
chromosome.
you slow down because of energy, and you're quite right. But at the end, what is strongly believed is at the ends of the chromosomes, quite right. You know, you have these caps, yeah, called telomeres. And these caps protect the chromosome, just like a cap on your head, if you were to look at it that way. As you get older, it has been shown that these caps wear down. So as they wear down, they expose the chromosomes, and the chromosomes then begin to break down, right, on the ends. Now remember, the chromosomes have the genes that code for different proteins and so on. So therefore, as they wear away, you know, you would find then that certain proteins are not produced as efficiently or in the quantities as when you're younger. So theoretically, the big theory is if you could find a way to preserve the telomeres or the caps at the end of the chromosomes, theoretically, you should live forever, because therefore, you know, at least in terms of the aging process, aging wouldn't occur because of those caps always being there. Yeah. So back to you. Yes?
Have you ever wonder if that is a gene that some people actually carry? Because
yeah, sure.
You ever notice that some people, like, you know, they'd say like these people in dying. You know what I mean, like that?
Looking, some people, you swear there's vampire or something.
Yeah,
you see them in the 80s, they're looking the same like when I was in the 40s. It have this guy who lives by my mother. I kid you not, I know him from childhood. So now in his 40s. And literally, he said he has to get carded. He can put on a khaki pants and a shirt, you know, and he would look like he in primary school. I kid you not. So, you know, there are some people, there's definitely a genetic component as it relates to that. And who knows, that's a very good point. If you do the studies then and have a look at their telomeres, you probably will find then that, you know, the rate of breakdown of those telomeres in persons who really look young is quite slower than persons who look old. Right? You know, it has in fact, it has some young children who look like old man, you know, and they're now 3 or 4 years old, right? So maybe it has something to do with that. Most definitely, yeah. But in terms of the curvature of the spine, as you rightly said, as somebody was highlighting, it goes with some persons that go hand in hand. Some persons, you know, as they get older, yeah, they get more and more haunched. And it has to do, you know, with this curvature. This curvature increases inward. And here in particular, the cervical, what is called, quote unquote, bossy back, you know, haunched, and the neck. If you were to think about, you know, your neck usually stands, the neck comes forward. And sometimes, you know, so you have, and this curves in even more. But that as well has a lot to do with these intervertebral discs. So it's a multiplicity of things all tied in, but it's part of course, the aging which occurs. All right, atlas and axis. So what numbers are associated with these two, the atlas and the axis? Okay, well, it's actually written here, C1 and C2. Right, so if we were to go back here, The C1 or the cervical, the first vertebra, and the C2 means cervical, second vertebra. This one on the top is the axis, the atlas, sorry, and the one below, which allows pivoting, is the axis. Right, so this takes the weight, C1 takes the weight, C2 allows pivoting to occur, movement of the head. So if you had some kind of injury to C2, you'd find that you wouldn't be able to move your head if you had some kind of crushing injury, because the axis vertebra, this allows the pivoting of the head, whereas the C1, it supports the head. And of course, you all know the story of Atlas back in the days. Yes, right. So Greek mythology, he did something a little naughty. So to punish him, they made him hold up the world. So whenever you see that image, sometime you would see it, Atlas, this man holding up a globe on his shoulders. And in a similar way, that's why they named this Atlas. It holds up the head, first vertebra, C1. So another terminology for Atlas, C1, and the axis is C2. This terminology as well.
Teaching us to connect things like this, so could we say it spins on the axis?
Yeah.
To do the movement?
Yeah, it spins on this, yeah. So that's why you have, that's why they call it the axis, and this one holds it up. That's why they call it the atlas. Yeah. And then this one, these are the thoracic, so they're numbered T1 through T12. Right, the thoracic vertebra, notice they get larger because they're supporting more weight. As you go down, it's more and more weight, right? Whereas this one, L5, have all that weight above. So which is the largest of the lot, yeah? L5. Lumbar vertebra 5. Always important to take care of your vertebra. Anybody here does yoga? Or I know yoga in particular, you know, it's big on, or Tai Chi is very good, you know, on promoting flexibility. You know, it's always important. Yes, go ahead.
So, if one of these bones here, because I know I have a friend who have a slip disc, right? So, but aside from that, so if one of these bones get fractured or something, they can't put a cast on the person, so they're gonna be bedridden.
It all depends on the type of injury. That's a very good question. What's a bone doctor called? I never remember it. What's a bone doctor? I always want to say osteo, but it's not osteo. You don't usually prefix osteo. Ortho.
Is it a chiropractor?
Orthopedist or orthopedic surgeon. A chiropractor, they're right. That's an osteopathic doctor which manipulates the spine by, you know, turning and cracking, and they're very good. Right, you know, some people don't really believe in them, but they're quite good. I remember when I was much younger, I had a stiff neck. Anybody ever got a stiff neck? You know, when you sleep bad, right? Yeah. And I get up in the morning, and you know, you can't move. You move. If you want to turn to the left, you have to move your whole body. You have to literally turn your whole body. Right? I was about age 9 or so, and I remember I had a stiff neck. And my father went and got a pundit friend of his, and he bring him home. Right, and I remember, you know, he there, and he feeling my neck, and he say, "All right, I'm feeling it," and you know, he say, "Hold on," and he twist my head. You know, he put his hands under my jaw, you know, one on either side of the jaw, and twist it, and then he feel again to the back. He say, "Almost there," and he do it again and twist it, feel again, and he say, "All right, it gone back in," and within about 5 minutes, I was good to go. It was absolutely incredible. You know, my father wanted to give him something, but of course he said, "Nah, can't take anything. If there's anything, give something to the you know, to his ministry." But how if you take money for that, how he lose the talent, you know? So give something to the temple instead. So I thought that was just incredible. I always remember that to this day, how my stiff neck was. And you know, just moments before I couldn't move it. And this guy came along, and within 5 minutes I was able to go. So back to your in terms of osteopathic medicine, in terms of a chiropractor, yeah, they're able to manipulate joints and, you know, yeah, easier pain. And I know some people really have severe back pains. They suffer a lot with their pain, or they might have gotten some type of accident which causes pain. So that's an issue. But back to the question, if you do, it depends on where the fracture is in terms of the healing process. It depends on if they have the flexibility to have downtime to rest to cause the healing. And it depends on which one is fractured. If it's, these are thinner, so the ability of them to heal might be faster because you have less weight. But if it's a lumbar vertebra, these are a little more tricky. They're taking all the weight. And in particular, if it's not healed and they're still moving, that could become a little tricky. I know sometimes they have to put pins in to keep it in place. So it all depends on the type of fracture which would dictate what type of procedure they have to carry on. Do they put on a cast? I know with persons who have scoliosis, where they have a curvature of the spine, literally. Some persons, not only we have curves this way, but you could have, where this runs straight, you could have a curvature going like this, Some people, I don't know if you've ever seen some people, literally, they're twisted to the side.
So, excuse?
Yeah.
When they have scoliosis and stuff, do they use a cast or does use a brace?
Yeah,
It's really a
correct.
brace.
Yeah, I was coming along that, and you're quite right. They use a brace. They don't put them in a cast, something like with plastic and with well, now it's Velcro, to tighten and so on. And then you go and they do tighten it. So that's quite right. If it's extreme, they do surgery, and in some cases they put rods along the spine to actually keep it in place together with that brace as well. So sometimes, yes, the brace would straighten it, but if not, they do have to go in and do some surgical interventions where that twisting is concerned, because depending on the twist, it could be causing pain because you do have nerves. Remember, your spinal nerves come out and you could have compression on those nerves that does cause pain, right? You could have a pinched nerve, and not only if the nerve is pinched, the innervation or the area that is innervated by that nerve, that will be affected. So that's why it's important that that is monitored as well. Yeah. Good question. So to answer your question, it all depends on the nature of the injury as it relates to the vertebra. All right, so here looking at the vertebra. So which one is which? Which one is the thoracic vertebra? The first one, the second one, or the third one? Which one is the thoracic?
The second one.
Which one is the lumbar? The first or second or the third?
The third.
And which one is the cervical?
The first.
First. How you know? Right? Because of this, yeah. It says C4, so it's the fourth cervical. The first one tells you where it is C for cervical, T for thoracic, L for lumbar, and the number tells you where it is on it, the fourth, the sixth, and the second. So if you were to go back, cervical.
So those are like locators then?
Yeah, so C4, cervical, 1, 2, 3, 4, this one. T2, thoracic, second one, L4, lumbar, the fourth one. So that's how they locate it. This is particularly useful to persons who, radiographers who do x-rays in particular in terms of showing or identifying where it is. Also, if they're doing, let's say, cancer therapy, and you have to be using directed radioactive interventions, right? It's very important that you know where it is you're having the beam pointed at. We all remember with a little bit of sadness, the issue that happened up at the Brian Lara Cancer Center not too long ago regarding the guy from Smokey and Bunty, right? In which unfortunately, they used too much. The dosage, it wasn't well calibrated, the machine. So they gave him the amount of radiation was too much, and it actually killed him, right? So always have to be careful where that is concerned. But yeah, but this gives the location of the different vertebra. All right, now let's look. We looked at the lumbar, the vertebra. Let's now get to the thoracic area. So here we're looking at the rib cage, or sometimes called the rib cage, and we have 7 true ribs and the false ribs and the floating ribs. Somebody could tell me the difference. What is the difference between the true, false, and floating ribs? What's the difference?
So don't answer yet. Don't answer.
Okay.
Don't answer yet. the floating, I'm going to go with one that I saw on the slide from a reading this morning. The false one, I think they on one cartilage or something like that. I think it was 3 on 1 cartilage.
Yeah, the false
Somebody
one.
else had to remember the floating. And the floating one, not attached to anything. I think that's on
Relating to the sternum. So they're not attached to the sternum at all. So they're floating. If you notice, they're attached to the vertebra on one end, but they're not attached to the sternum superiorly in front. Right. And what about the true ribs then? You kind of answered there.
They're attached to the sternum?
All
they
attached to the
They all
sternum.
attached to the sternum, yes. So this one, there's the cartilage for it for number 7. So the true are attached to it, the false, they all attached through one, and the floating, they're not attached at all to the sternum, as shown here. All right. So that's very good. And then these are just showing the parts of the sternum itself, the manubrium, the sternal angle, the body, and the xiphoid process as a little pointy part of the thigh. It looks like a thigh. Intercostal space. In between here, we have the intercostal muscles, which are very important for the respiration. You look at that in SnF2, intercostal muscles. And then, of course, right here, we have the diaphragm. So the diaphragm, intercostals, and of course, you have the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which goes from the clavicle to the sternum. Those 3 are the main ones responsible for respiration, but the 2 major ones really are the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, which actually move it. You'll speak more to that when you get into SnF2 and you look at respiration. All right. And that's it in terms of the lecture for today. Today is indeed a short one. All right, so what did we look at today? Well, in terms of the lecture itself, we started off by mentioning we're looking at the axial. We spoke about the functions of the skeletal system itself. I'll just come to you shortly, Jamila. In terms of the major functions, we have support, protection.
No, sir, sorry.
Yes?
My hand was up all the time. I didn't even realize that.
Oh, my bad. Let me take it down for you. Sorry. Yeah, so the functions of the skeletal system in terms of support, protection, movement, blood cell formation, storage of calcium and fat, the importance of the skeletal system as it relates to protection, very important, and which is why bones and important structures in the body are encased. Organs and some of the important structures in the body are encased in bone. We gave the example of the brain and the bone marrow encasing the hematopoietic stem cells, which are responsible for the formation of red blood cells. Also mentioned as well calcium through the action of the parathyroid hormone. You have the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts breaking it down and to release calcium in times of when we need calcium or when we need to lower the levels of calcium in the blood itself. So that was important there. We looked at the structure of the bone in terms of the long bone. 2 important parts which we highlighted, the compact bone and the spongy bone. And we looked at the structure of the spongy bone, which is used in terms of using iodine to do the staining, Haversian canals. And when we saw the circular pattern, is always important. And it's usually a favorite, the bone, in terms of that image for spotter exams. Yeah, it's the only image I could think of slide in which they use iodine to stain. So anytime you see one with circles and it's black, yeah, it's compact bone, that should come to mind. Axial skeleton, components, the skull vertebra, ribs and sternum. Mention the lambdoid joint and the importance of fontanelles. 1, to allow for expansion of organs and for the brain, to allow the expansion of the vertebral column, to allow the expansion of the jaw, and also 2, for vaginal delivery, where you do have distortion of the skull as it does pass through the vaginal passage to ensure tearing does not occur. Skull parts, we mentioned the major parts of the skull, the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal regions, the mandible and the maxilla. Mandible, think about a man with a beard, so therefore the beards is the lower part, so that the mandible is the lower part, whereas the maxilla is the upper jaw. We mentioned as well in terms of the occipital, the large hole through the occipital region, the foramen magnum, that's where the spinal cord comes through. So after the spinal cord leaves the cranium, it goes now to the vertebral column. And then we have, in terms of the division of the vertebra, you have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, and coccygeal, 7, 12, 5, 5, 4 in terms of the divisions which occur there. Major, the first one, C1 and C2. In fact, those are the only vertebrae that have names. All the others, they're just given, you know, coordinates as in C1, L1, L2. But C1 and C2 are the only ones that have names, C1 being the atlas, C2 being the axis. And we rounded it up by looking at the thoracic cage, where we mentioned the reasons of the true ribs, the false ribs, and the floating ribs, the rationale behind their names. Okay.